couldn't hazard a guess as to why it flopped on its first release, but it's lasted, which tells us that there indeed is something there.
Richard, did you see the hands that went up for people watching this for the first time?
Well, that's good. I mean, I'd love to know what your impression was, but I've seen it several times, and it never loses its effect. And I am kind of a hard case, and it can still make me weepy. So they were doing something right.
I mean, it's so beautiful. I mean, Richard, I know you've got an incredible career, and I followed you, but, when I was, going through your work and reading about you, one of the things that you said was that this film had a huge influence on you. Talk about the first time, if you can remember, seeing this, and why, what was it that resonated with you?
Well, the film was photographed by Joe Byrock, who was a very steady Hollywood old-timer, and it was a shared credit with another fella named Joe Walker, who was Frank Capra's favorite cinematographer. Apparently, they did 20 movies together. And oddly enough, there was a third uncredited cinematographer named Victor Milner, who probably shot some of the special effects or maybe the titles. And but ironically, he also shot a film in 1940 called Christmas in July, which is kind of what we're dealing with here tonight as well. But what affected me early on, I suppose, being obsessive about getting into cinematography, was watching old films like these. Now, this was really the epitome of old-style, classical Hollywood cinematography. There are many examples, but this is a very good one. It runs the gamut: high key, low key, low contrast, high contrast. And the beauty of it is when you analyze it closely, everything about it serves the story on some level or another. It underpins the drama of what's happening in the script, what's happening with the actors. It supports everything so beautifully that you never notice it. As a viewer, as a civilian viewer, you would never notice it, but it's there. It's a big part of cinematography. Our job as cinematographers very often is to finish an expert second to the director, to be there, to deliver the goods, to deliver their vision, but do it in a way that generally won't call attention to itself, that will support the story strongly, but in a subtle way at the same time. I hate when technique overtakes the story. And it never happens here. This is really sort of a flawless example of that as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I mean, talking about subtleties, the one thing I love is the framing, the composition of, how they reflected George's state of mind. So whenever he's, having this conflict and feeling, it's basically these framing to reflect his mental state. And you'll see him in doorways. Talk about that little subtle detail and, how that has, impacted cinematography to this very day.
Well, composition is one of our main tools, setting the frame. This film was photographed in 1:3:3:1 aspect ratio, which would mean that the image is 1 1/3, essentially, 1 1/3 times wider than it is tall. And that was the standard for many, many years for all of film history, pretty much from the silent era straight up until the early 1950s when CinemaScope came about, which was 2.4 to 1, which was almost 2.5 times wider. And that was evolved as a response to television, where people were staying away from cinemas and they had to bring them back by giving them something they couldn't get at home, which was a bigger, more grand image, a grander image. So that was the dawn of CinemaScope, or anamorphic photography, as we call it. But nonetheless, the artistic use of composition, and that's something that I really, for some reason tonight, keyed in on. The great compositions, tons of people, artfully arranged, to land in the right spots at the right time. And the camera will move and maybe pan, tilt, dolly, and end up someplace else in an absolutely precise composition. It looks effortless on screen. It's not easy to do. It can take, sometimes you get lucky and it happens on the first take, and you go, boy, that was great. Most times it's not like that, and it can take, depending on the complexity of what you're doing, it can take many, many chances to do that, to get it right. And here, it's so organic and natural, and once again, it never takes you out of the drama of what's happening in the plot, in the story, in the acting.
I love that. Before we came in here, we were talking about the film. It's a Wonderful Life is such a classic. Every Christmas people watch it. It's ranked on many, top movies of all time. But at the time when it came out, so it was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and it was still considered a flop. The film lost money too when it was released, and things changed probably around the 60s or 70s. Talk a little bit about the film and the social, society at the time, and why this shift happened and why this film got this life that it's had.
Well, there's something very elemental about it, very human. I think everyone can relate to. I couldn't hazard a guess as to why it flopped on its first release, but it's lasted, which tells us that there indeed is something there. You can imagine it was made in 1947, and which was only 2 years after the end of World War II. Jimmy Stewart, a bona fide war hero who had some hellacious experiences in Europe, Frank Capra as well. They were just adjusting to being home at that point 2 years later, and they were still finding themselves, I'm sure, while they made this film. So something, I think, intangible comes through about that. It makes me sad to think about this movie a little bit in terms of how that was a time when you could present sentiments like that without irony. People embrace that across the board, and that might have some connection with why it's remained popular through all these years. I mean, just think of the difference between 1947, the culture in 1947, and a short 20 years later, 1967, and let's say the Summer of Love. You couldn't match those two periods up. It's impossible to have imagined something like that, an evolution and a change in society. Yet this movie has endured through that and so much more. I think it's just that human element, that feeling that living, breathing, vulnerable people came together and made this movie, and it serves as a record of that moment in time.
Going back to the lighting, it is such a great study of lighting, especially for cinematography. As you said, it's the high key lighting with low contrast lighting, low key lighting with high contrast lighting, and the backlighting too, which is so fascinating. Is there a scene in the film, that you're like that really has impacted you, or other cinematographers too? Because I know this film is so influential to many cinematographers because of moments.
I think for me personally, the lower key stuff, the nighttime material, it's really very artfully executed. In black and white, as opposed to color, you're dealing with the challenge, and a great part of the challenge as a cinematographer is to separate planes and values of gray. In color, separation is generally made automatically by color. But in black and white, everything is a shade of gray, and you have to make sure that things don't sort of fall into a murkiness or are separated from the background enough to create depth. And at night, there's some great examples of that. When Donna Reed and Jimmy Stewart are first, when they're in their early courting stage, and it's right after the dance, and they're outside her home, and backlight, there's a two-shot of them in a profile, and they're pretty much backlit, and it's a very fine, it's so carefully modulated in terms of exposure and what Joe Walker or Joe Byrock were doing photographically. It's so tastefully and artfully done, and it created planes of depth between the foreground and the house in the background. There was some light in the windows, and it was just, I thought it was a beautiful frame. I'd love to have a still of that frame. It was really, I think for me, it sets the tone for the whole movie. You know, you feel that you're in very competent photographic hands here, you know, and nobody is looking at it on such a granular level as I would be here tonight. I mean, you would think I was crazy if I told you some of the things that I key in on. Excuse me, I'm hoarse from getting on and off airplanes the last week. But the things that I notice like that, they stick with me, you know? And I think it's just part of being obsessive about what we do and having a real passion for it. I mean, these things invigorate you. They inspire you. They get the juices flowing again. Even in my inept way of trying to adapt that in my own work or apply it in some form somewhere, it becomes a touchstone. And that's one of the great, I think, gifts of being fortunate enough to do what I do.
You know, the one thing that we have now as a luxury is the iPhone, because you can take a photo of something and use the black and white filter to see what it would look like. Talk about the challenges as a cinematographer of working in black and white, you know, nowadays in 2025, and what would it have been like in, you know, in the 1940s when they didn't even have that technology? So,
well, you know, like? In the old days of film, and black and white film in particular, things were a lot simpler in a lot of ways, but a lot more complicated in other ways. Everything pretty much outside of some sort of special effect had to be done at the lens at the time you've shot it. You'd have no second chance to get it right in post-production again. Whereas today, we're living in a digital world, and regardless if you originate on film, which is still viable and it's still around on a certain level, or originate digitally, which is the majority of what happens today, you've got practically an infinite number of ways to manipulate the image, which is one of the brilliant things about digital technology. If you can imagine it, you can pretty much create it pretty easily compared to the old days when you were stuck with mechanical processes, and it was a mechanical, industrial way of making images. And you think about the cameras, an old Mitchell BNC, which was the standard in those days, weighed 100 pounds when it was all tricked out for production with a blimp to keep the camera quiet. Yet it didn't inhibit them from moving the camera, flying the camera, cranes, this, whatever it might be. You know, all of the examples from that era, all the movies you've seen from that period, the heaviness and clumsiness of a lot of what we would consider today heavy and clumsy, it didn't stop them from making great movies and delivering great images. You know, today, again, the iPhone, and we've got hundreds of little examples that we can use, and everyone's got one in their pocket. So everybody, in essence, is a cinematographer, I guess, on some level.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that. You actually sat through most of this film, and you said, you know, watching it, you're going through different, you know, things are going through your mind as a cinematographer. Is there a scene that, you know, you want to talk about that you're like was really great seeing on the big screen and
what got me the most was the scene after things are really going bad for Jimmy Stewart, and he comes in and to his home on Christmas Eve, and he's just absolutely miserable to his family. Photographically, it's very simple, and that's the beauty of it, because it doesn't get in the way of the emotion. It was such that was some of his best acting. I mean, it was such a turn of the character. You know, he's so likable through so much of the movie, and suddenly I was cringing the way he treated his kids. It was horrible. But it was real and it was genuine. And the photography was good, clean, professional work. There was undistinguished beyond that, but it served the material. It didn't get in the way of anything. And I should say something about Donna Reed's close-ups. Talk about classical Hollywood. You don't need to be a cinematographer to see a shift in the texture when we cut to a close-up of Donna Reed. There's a reason for that, because in the old days, that's the way they did things. That was the norm. The standard was your female star was, she might have just come out of a typhoon, but she's going to look fantastic. And this was no example or no excuse to do something different. Diffusion, you'd put a filter, a glass filter in front of the lens that has something that degrades the image a certain amount, and it'll soften the image and take any flaws or anything out. Not that Donna Reed had any flaws, but it'll tend to smooth things out depending on the type and the grade of filter you use. And it's there, and it's not too heavy. It doesn't call too much attention to itself, but it's definitely there. And I from your response, I think everybody saw it and noticed it. That sort of treatment has been out of style pretty much for a very, very long time. But at that time, no one would have blinked to think about that. That's just the way it was done. But man, she looked exquisite. You know, we often don't think of Donna Reed when we think of great beauties or great movie stars, and man, I thought she had it in spades. Just fantastic.
Aside from that, I mean, talk about the framing of her and like those close-ups. Like, why was she always in a close-up? Like, what's that story behind that?
Once again, I think it's the emotion. She was, when you saw those close-ups, sort of that size, you noted the first thing I noticed, in addition to the filtration, is her eyes. Her eyes. And there was a single point, single source that you could see reflected in her eyes, which is just the old-time cinematographers. They knew their stuff, and they took their time to find the right way to light the female stars. And by seeing that one point source in her eye, it tells me that the two Joes, whichever one did those shots, they knew exactly where to place that light to get the best effect and bring out her features in the most pleasing, most beautiful way. So, you know, focal length, the type of lens that was used, not too long, not too short. Probably in those days, for close-ups, 50-millimeter lenses generally did the close-ups. Today, we're all over the ice. There's no more convention like that. But things in terms of a convention would be in the range of a 40 or 50-millimeter lens for a shot like that. And it's just right because it presents your features in a very natural way. It doesn't have any distorting factors in the way the optics treat the human face.
Well, to that, you know, you've got Donna Reed, and then we've talked about George being trapped within the frame, literally. How did they tell the story of like hint at hope in the story and freedom and just that possibility there of?
Gosh, you know, I haven't thought of it like that. Although it's there, and
It's there, right?
yeah, oh, it's there. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just the last frame. I missed the last 15 minutes or so when I came in just long enough to see the last minute or so, and that last frame of the family and the composition, and it's just, it hits that note. And if you took that, I think, as sort of a cue against everything else that happens in that range of emotion, you know, it's like very reassuring, and everything's back on track, and it's all going to be okay now. You know, that even though we know in real life that's rarely the case, but that's why we go to the movies, and this one really, I think, presented that in a very, very effective way.
We're in a world now where we've touched on it. Technology. We've got iPhones. There's now drones. Which cinematographers are starting to use. Talk about why this film is such an important study, in cinematography and
Well, it's
filmmaking.
once again in the classical style. The camera doesn't move generally speaking. The camera doesn't move unless there's a reason to move. Someone moves, or they're trying to make some certain point. There's nothing gratuitous, or there's nothing sloppy or haphazard about any of it. I suppose it helps to have been working in the studio era on what was essentially, in many ways, an assembly line, and there were ways of doing things and equipment that was used, and procedures that were followed every time out that led to a style. You can argue for it or against it. It lasted for as long as it did, and then started to change as things inevitably do. And we have today so many more tools, so many more options and ways of doing things, but I don't think necessarily there's any correlation between that and better films. Every once in a while someone comes along with something shot with an iPhone, or however, with no money or with lots of money and all the bells and whistles, and somehow they make it work, because it's not about the tech, it's about the thought and the emotion behind it, really. It's just the camera is like a hammer is to a carpenter. It's a tool. And it could be a drone, it could be an iPhone, it could be anything. We've got so many things today that makes my head spin sometimes. And I think back, I said, gosh, how easy they had. They had a lot fewer choices, and they really had to buckle down and think about how to use what they had to the best of what it was capable of delivering.
How has, in your body of work, have you, referenced It's a Wonderful Life at all?
I don't know that I would have referenced it, but stuff about it sinks in without knowing, and I don't know that I could point to anything I've done that would match this or remotely. But in terms of studying all kinds of films that you watch just because you're a fan, and I love them, and they contribute in some level or another, something about it must have sunk in somewhere, just that notion, that sincerity. And I go back to the feeling of having human handprints on something. With a lot of our digital tools today and a lot of what we're doing, a lot of that can get lost in the process because we're just overwhelmed with so much technology. But if you can manage to navigate that jungle and maintain that level of human contact with the material, I think that comes through. And through that comes the things you've absorbed and gets splattered out in your own interpretation that you're probably unconscious of anyway.
Are there cinematographers out there who, come to mind who have also been influenced by It's a Wonderful Life?
Oh, I suppose every one of us who've seen it, because I can still sit and watch a film as anyone else and enjoy it without deconstructing it too heavily. But inevitably, you go back to it and then really start to pick it apart and find the things that you really liked and say, how'd they do that? Why do I like it or not like it? And how can I use it or not? Everybody who's a student of film, not just cinematographers, I'm sure, have taken something from it.
Let's talk about the experience, because most, the first time I saw this was actually, on the TV and at home, and without surround sound, and I've seen it on the big screen, and it's such an amazing experience. Talk about this experience of the community watching a film like this, and it's why it's important.
There's nothing better than seeing a film with an audience, That's one thing we've lost in the digital era. Is we used to go to film dailies after a shooting day and look at the work we'd done the day before in a room like this, if you're in a good city or if you're home here, and the crew members would show up, and it would be a communal thing. It would be a real bonding experience, and that we don't have so much of anymore in the digital era. But in terms of, I'm sorry, I've gone off on a tangent.
No, I was like, why the viewing experience? Like,
Oh,
why?
yes, indeed. First off, hats off to Barco. I thought that looked fabulous, and I'm sitting watching and thinking, I wonder what that was. And it is a true. Someone went to the effort of producing a digital cinema package, so it's the genuine item. They took very good care in restoring the film. It looks great, and I've been watching Barco improve one upon the other for many, many years at this point, and this just looked fabulous. But the communal experience, this is great, to be in a room like this and feel what's coming off the screen, reaching everyone, affecting the barometric pressure of the space, laughter, tears, whatever. It's unmistakable, and it's great to be home and look at the great big screen you've got now, and you can stop and start it and do this and that, but it's not the same. It's just not. I really still, I'd argue for the theatrical experience till the end of my days. It's just the best.
We can have a whole other conversation about what filmed for IMAX, filmed in IMAX means. But, this is Frank Capra, great, one of his greats. For the audience out there, what other films by Frank Capra would you recommend that they go home and watch and see?
All of them. Mr. Deeds Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart again. Gosh, I looked through a few of them this afternoon, and they escape me right now. Help me out. Meet John Doe. Meet John Doe. Hang on. Let me
Pull up his IMDb.
No, my cheat sheet right
Your
here.
cheat sheet. He's got it.
Yeah, hang on a second here. But look, Capra, obviously, one of the greats. Yeah, It Happened One Night. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Right, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. Meet John Doe. Yes. Yeah, and he did 20 films with Joe Walker, as I said earlier, the cinematographer who's second build here. They must have been doing something right, because every one of those titles, if you look through them on IMDb, you go, oh yeah, that one, yeah, that's good. They're all, right down the line. Every one of them could stand on their own and stand several viewings,
Well, last question. Frank Capra, he had his go-to cinematographer. Talk about that important relationship between the director and the cinematographer. So many times, we're still seeing it today. Spike Lee has his go-to, Christopher Nolan has his go-to, Denis Villeneuve.
Yes, it is, the director-cinematographer relationship is it's unique, and it's special. It should be based on communication. The cinematographer's job is to interpret the director's vision for the film. Not to make your own film, not to shoot beautiful pictures, not to do anything. Your job is to support the director and deliver their interpretation of what's on the page, turn it into something concrete that can be shared with other people. So the best relationships are the ones where it's based on an open and brutally honest communication and collaboration, where hopefully in most instances you'll both have great ideas, and when you start to kick them around, it'll give birth to something even better that neither one of you might have come to on your own. There are all sorts of directors. Some are very savvy about the camera and lenses and the technology, and they know exactly this type of shot, and they can explain very clearly about what they want. Others prefer to work more with the actors and leave the rest of it to the cinematographer. And then there's any number of grades in between. But the key to it is to have an open, vigorous, unending, good-natured, hopefully, collaboration, which doesn't mean you can't disagree, but disagree respectfully and find a way to make sure you're doing the best job you possibly can with the means and time and people and resources that you have. And again, from a cinematographer point of view, serving the director's vision, you know, which means a lot of talk, a lot of communication, a lot of sitting with the script and breaking things down ahead of time, and deciding on looks and approaches and technology and themes that you can impart photographically to support, once again, the story. That's what it's all about.
And they totally did that here in It's a Wonderful Life.
They did a beautiful job, my goodness.
Incredible. Well, Richard, thank you so much for
Thank
that
you.
insight and that conversation. Thank
Thank
you all
you
for
all.
coming out
Thank you.
tonight. Thank you to Soho House, to the Variety team, and of course to Barco.